Hi, this is Eric. I'm back with another video. It's Wednesday, September 17th, 2025. And I'm going to do a video about an article that I just posted yesterday, which is a completely written article. It has various links in it, which I thought I really needed to bring to people's attention. So the backstory of this is that just in the past, week or so, I've had a chance to hang out with some people, and it became apparent to me that there's still a lot of misapprehension, misunderstanding of what is actually going on in Ukraine. So I felt like what I really needed to do is to explain that. The issue is that if you try to talk with people about what is actually going on there, they'll just, and you um, couch it in a form that would appear to verify or back up the Russian narrative. They just say, oh, that's just Russian propaganda. So I wrote an article which says, was the CIA spreading Russian propaganda? Every time somebody says something that they don't agree with, they just say, oh, you're a Russian agent, or you're a propagandist for Russia, or, something like that. And which I think is, like I was hanging out with some people. They're people that I know from business, and one of them, he's a really nice guy. He's a friend of mine. He's been very helpful to me, good-natured person. And he said, "So you're spreading Russian propaganda, huh?" I just thought, man, don't do that, because if I am found to be spreading Russian propaganda, somebody may shoot me. Look what they did to poor Charlie Kirk. Well, I won't. I won't. Charlie Kirk is a whole other. What can I say? Topic. I'll just leave it in those neutral terms. Topic that I won't talk about, except to say that it is a symptom of the underlying malaise and ongoing deterioration of social relations in the United States. Let's just leave it at that. But another example of that is that I cannot make a statement about something which is controversial, and people will just pigeonhole me and say, oh, you're just spreading propaganda. So that was one example. Another example is that somebody that I know quite well, wanted to send money to Ukraine. And I'm thinking, what are you doing? Here's this guy, here's the president of Ukraine. He just bought a bank. He bought a bank, and he's got these huge, real estate property. Where did he get the money for that? Somebody posted. I think it was on Twitter. I think Ivanka Trump, I think, said, "How much do you trust Zelensky?" A, B, C, D, E. 100%, 80%, 60%, 40%, 20%, zero. And I just said, I trust him. He's great at playing the piano with his male member, but where did he get the money to buy a bank? And how many people have died because of his policies? So let's. It's so simplistic to just say, oh, do you trust or don't you trust? You got to ask the right questions. So that is my methodology. I try to, when a phenomenon arises, I try to ask the right questions. So the article is, what was the CIA spreading Russian propaganda? And it turns out what Russia speaks about regarding its Ukraine problem is documented. It's not just something they pulled out of their hat. It's documented by the CIA. So I'll kind of read through here and do some comments. The so-called Ukraine war started, we are told, with Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. This point is hammered home on the brains of Western media consumers endlessly. Because of this relentless narrative, most Westerners are grossly uninformed about the circumstances leading up to what Russia calls its special military operation, not a war. When the U.S. went to war in Iraq, Vietnam, Japan, Afghanistan, Korea, it didn't mess around. The Korean War resulted in, and I'm quoting here, the effects of the war were acutely felt on the Korean peninsula, where more than 2 million were killed, as many as 70% of them, 70% civilians. The United States dropped more explosives on North Korea during the 3-year conflict than in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. As a result of the bombing, an estimated 85% of the buildings in the country were destroyed. This is from the Council on Foreign Relations. So, you probably, if you can't trust them, who can you trust? They're meddling in all the countries all over the world. Now, contrast that with the attack on the Soviet Union started with the invasion of Ukraine. This is back in 1941. And what I've done is included a World War II documentary made by the United States. And they say it's a production of the War Department, because during World War II, what we used to call the Department of Defense was called the War Department. They called things by their true names. So is it Russia propaganda or U.S. propaganda? Well, it was created by the U.S. War Department. However, since Russia launched its operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, the civilian areas of Ukraine have not been targeted by Russia. Otherwise, why are most civilian buildings in Kiev, Odessa, Kharkov, and other cities left alone? So this is not a kind of war that the United States wages. When they wage a war, they destroy everything. That is not what has been happening in Ukraine. Nevertheless, the West has portrayed Russia as the aggressor, failing to provide the reasons for Russia's invasion. Specifically, the attacks on civilians inside the area of Ukraine following the coup staged by the U.S. government. It overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine and replaced it with a virulent neo-Nazi regime that immediately proceeded to kill its opposition, anyone who wanted good relations with Russia. And it set up CIA bases inside of Ukraine, including biowarfare labs. As an aside, even during Congression, you say, oh, come on, they wouldn't do anything like that. Well, in congressional testimony, Victoria Nuland, who was the architect of that coup in 2014, was asked about biolabs, and she said, there are biological research facilities, and we don't want the Russians to get their hands on them, because they're going to expose the fact that they're biowarfare labs. That's why. For 8 years, the Ukraine regime broke the Minsk agreements. They were to allow the Russian-speaking areas to maintain their own culture as guaranteed by international law. The UN says that minorities and countries have the right to their own customs. Instead, the Ukrainian coup government systematically violated those agreements, specifically bombing civilians. I personally met in 2015 a couple with their child whose house had been bombed by the Kiev regime. This is in 2015, long before Russia started its special military operation. If your house were bombed by political fanatics, what would you do? Finally, after 8 years of thousands dead, maimed, tortured, and facing an imminent attack to finish them off, people in the Donbass region of Russia, of Ukraine actually, now Russia, appealed to Russia to finally put a stop to it. That was the cause of Russia intervening in what was essentially a U.S.-fomented civil war with the aim of weakening Russia to gain control of its resources. The film that I have attached here, which you should watch, because this is a U.S. government film, explains what the reality of the war on Russia was about during World War II, and it explains why there's so much interest in Russia now. It's all about the resources. It's a huge country with lots of resources. The West has been, their business model for the last 500 years has been going into countries and stealing their resources. Russia's the biggest resource container in the planet. So that is the underlying cause of this whole crisis. So what is the current government in Ukraine? I will show in this article that when the West accuses Russia of spreading presumably false propaganda, it actually points the finger at itself. I use officially declassified documents readily available online if you're willing to look for them. The U.S. accuses Russia of cooking up false propaganda. That's why my friends say, "Oh, Eric, you're just talking Russian propaganda. You don't know what you're talking about. You're lying. You blah, blah, blah." That's what they say. So I say, "Oh, well, so are you calling the CIA a liar?" Because they're the ones where this documentation comes from. The U.S. accuses Russia of cooking up false propaganda. It claims, nowadays, that Ukraine is a small, independent, democratic government fighting the Russian monster. In fact, it is a regime with roots going back to the Nazi invasion of Russia in World War II. And those roots lie directly with the CIA itself. Preposterous, you may think. But I'm enclosing official U.S. government documents that prove that what Russia says is true. West's denial of that are lies. Spheres of influence. Okay for me, but not for thee. This is again a U.S. government archival document. The U.S. Monroe Doctrine of 1823 declared the Western Hemisphere as off limits to anyone from outside the Americas, both North and especially Latin America. However, rather than protecting Latin America from European colonizers, it has interfered in numerous countries, staged or supported anti-democratic coups in numerous countries worldwide and specifically in Latin America. I've included a link to Wikipedia. However, the United States does not think that Russia has a right to its own sphere of influence. The United States invaded Russia in 1918 after the Russian Revolution, which is ironic because Russia refused to support the British Empire during the American Revolution. So during the American Revolution, the British said to the Russian Tsar, I think it was Catherine the Great, said, "Would you please send us some mercenaries so we can, fight those pesky American colonists, and that'll save us a few redcoats." So, when it came time for the Russian people to free themselves from their own royalty, just as the U.S. freed itself from its British royalty, the U.S. government said, "Oh, we can't allow that." The Soviet Union, of which Russia was an integral part, was invaded by the Nazi regime in Germany, as well as its European allies, such as Finland, Hungary, Romania, Italy, Bulgaria. It lost 27 million people, the majority civilians, between June 22, 1941 and May 1945. So in that invasion, the majority of the people who died were civilians. They weren't even soldiers. This is 60 times the losses that the United States experienced in World War II, and very, very few civilians died in World War II. The United States was virtually untouched. JFK said that during World War II, the equivalent from the East Coast up to Chicago was totally wiped out in the Soviet Union. So we're talking about an enormous territory that was completely devastated by the German invasion. A major part of the invasion took place through the then Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So the U.S. takeover of Ukraine in a U.S. coup is in effect an invasion and an extreme threat to Russia. Ukraine is in effect occupied territory, just as the Germans had occupied Ukraine during World War II. What did the U.S. do when in 1962 the Soviet Union put missiles into Cuba? It nearly went to nuclear war with the Soviet Union. For the U.S., it's unacceptable for any country to mess around near its territory. but perfectly okay for the U.S. to have a military presence surrounding Russia or China or many other countries. Well, as a patriotic American, you may think, okay, Russia lost 27 million people, but, that's their problem, not ours. But the problem is that Russia doesn't think so. So don't act surprised when, after years of failed and perfidious negotiations by the West, Russia finally used military force. The U.S. has used military force on false pretenses, like in Libya, where they accuse Libya of human rights violations. But when Russia actually protects people from human rights violations, you go, oh, you invaded. This is the sickness infecting U.S. Political consciousness, the political discourse. So I talk about why is Russia so touchy about the Kiev regime, the specific regime, and I include a document. Again, this is a document from the government archives, and it has a quote here regarding the leader of this movement in Ukraine during World War II. His name was Stefan Bandera. Stefan Bandera, I'm quoting here, was not a member of R33, one of the resistance movements, but was another personality, perhaps the personality of the Ukraine immigrant community that had to be recognized. According to an OSS, that's the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, Bandera had earned a fierce reputation for conducting a reign of terror during World War II. He led the largest faction of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which split when the war broke out. And Andrei Melnik, another Ukrainian nationalist, led the smaller part of that group. Both factions participated in terrorist activities against Polish officials before the war, and Ukrainian nationalists allied themselves with their Nazi quote-unquote liberators during the first days of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Operation Barbarossa was the name for the German operation to invade the Soviet Union. Even though OUN's enthusiasm diminished after the Nazis failed to support Ukrainian statehood, many Ukrainians continued to fight alongside the Germans until the end of the war. Here's what the CIA has to say about Stefan Bandera. And there's a lot of typographical errors here. I corrected some and left some alone. So it's kind of rough, but I'll do my best. During the first days of Bandera rule, terror was directed primarily against the organization headed by A. Melnik. The greater part of the leaders were killed openly or secretly. The brothers Pishliak, this is some rivals of Bandera, were brutally murdered. And it says the assassin was another person. His name is hard to pronounce because it's spelled strangely, was a Ukrainian communist. And at the same time, one of the leaders of Bandera's combat detachments. So it's a very motley group of people. Then came the turn of all Bandera's opponents among the Ukrainian people in general. Finally, the national minorities in western Ukraine, the Poles, were subjected to bloody persecution. It is difficult to estimate how many Poles were killed, but some data has been preserved, which shows that it says over 10,000 Jews were destroyed in a single operation in the border of the Carpathian Mountains of Ukraine. The Hungarian gendarmes drove these Jews out from the area which had been occupied by Germany with Hitler's consent. That's because Hungary at that time was an ally of Hitler. At the border, they were received by special elements of the Bandera militia, which drove them to unknown parts, destroying all of them en route. Altogether, during the 5 weeks of its existence, the Bandera state destroyed over 5,000 Ukrainians, 15,000 Jews, and several thousand Poles. This was a document that was classified, restricted, but it was made available. The Ukrainian state of Stefan Bandera ended its short but ignominious existence in August 1941, when it was announced in Lvov that Western Ukraine had been incorporated as the quote-unquote district of Galicia in the general governorship that is occupied Poland, and then a new order, Hitler style, began to be introduced in the Ukraine. And this, in short, is the story of Bandera's one-day holiday, which his followers, relying on people's forgetfulness, now to try to present as a glorious and heroic page in the history of the Ukrainian liberation movement. In reality, this is a CIA document. It would be best, especially for the supporters of a free Ukraine, to erase from the history of their movement this infamous Hitlerite fascist episode which brought nothing but shame and sorrow to Ukraine. This is from another U.S. document, archive.org. And I created a screenshot from this very rough document, and I'm quoting from it here. I retyped it. Stepan Bandera's agents, it is well known, attempted to terrorize Ukraine displaced persons in the camps of post-war Germany, committing violence on the inmates and not stopping at murder. It is known that his adherents have attempted to exert pressure on displaced persons who have emigrated to the United States on behalf of his organization. Bandera publishes a newspaper in Western Germany, and his extremist political organization promotes an avowedly totalitarian ideology. The paper also regularly attempts to stir up national animosities and indulges in unrelenting attacks on the United States, urging its readers not to cooperate with the United States authorities. The organization still practices terrorism in the emigre communities. This is as of the time of the writing. Here's another passage. It says, "There is little doubt that Stefan Bandera is extreme rightist in his political outlook. By nature, he is a political intransigent of great personal ambition who, using his party as a vehicle ambition, has consistently and often openly, since 1948, opposed all organizations in the emigration community which favor a representative form of government in the Ukraine as opposed to a mono-party Bandera regime." This guy was no Democrat. Let's put it that way. So there you have it. Now take a look at this picture. I'll include it. And there's a report. There are reports we're hearing in the news that President Zelensky is not cooperative enough with his paymasters in the United States and with Europe, and he's kind of fallen out of favor. And so instead, there was this general named General Zaluzhny, who was the original commander-in-chief, I guess you could say, of the Ukrainian army, and he was basically Zelensky fired him and sent him to England to be the ambassador to England to kind of get him out of his here. He was seen as a rival, apparently. But Valery Zaluzhny is touted as the next president of Ukraine. For some reason, the people in Ukraine, the polls, for what they're worth, say that he's popular. I mean, the guy lost, he lost a lot of battles and a lot of people died, but for some reason they think he's a good guy. So this is a picture of him. It says Valery Zaluzhny with Andriy Stepitsky, a commander of the fascist right sector. This is another one of these extremist organizations that have participated in the coup. Both men are photographed in front of the portrait of Ukrainian fascist leader Stepan Bandera. One of the common themes that I get from my enlightened Western friends is there's no Nazis in Ukraine. What are you talking about? After the U.S. coup in 2014, Bandera, whom the U.S. records themselves say was a terrorist, is now rehabilitated. They're renaming streets after him and putting up monuments. And this is an article from the World Socialist website, but it's for what it's worth. But it says they're talking about this. So the world, so they're socialists. What are they? They don't know anything. So I asked a friend of mine who lives in Ukraine, she's living in Ukraine, okay? And I said, what's going on with this? Is there really did they really rename a street Stepan Bandera Avenue? And sure enough, if you go to Google Maps, you can find a map of downtown Kiev with the name Stepan Bandera. It's like a major, artery, a major, throughway in Ukraine. But would the CIA actually support him, given who they understand him to be? So this is an article from Forward, which is a Jewish publication that's been around for a long, long time. My grandmother used to read it, but it's very well known. And this is what they have to say. In the years since the Maidan uprising brought a new government to Ukraine in 2014, which I've referred to, numerous monuments to Nazi collaborators and Holocaust perpetrators have been erected, at times as frequently as a new one each week. Due to the overwhelming number of streets named after Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukevich, another terrorist, only some are listed as part of this project. It goes on and says, in Lvov and Ivano-Frankivsk, which are two cities in Ukraine, 1.5 million Jews, a quarter of all Jews murdered in the Holocaust, came from Ukraine. Over the past 6 years, the country has been institutionalizing worship of the paramilitary Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, which I referred to earlier, which collaborated with the Nazis and aided in the slaughter of Jews. And the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, this is another organization which massacred thousands of Jews and 70,000 to 100,000 Poles. A major figure venerated in today's Ukraine is Stepan Bandera, born in 1909, and he died. He was probably assassinated in 1959. The Nazi collaborator who led a faction of the OUN. Now, it goes on and says, in Kiev in 2016, again corroborating my friend, a major Kiev boulevard was renamed after Bandera. The renaming is particularly obscene since the street leads to Baba Yar, the ravine where Nazis, aided by Ukrainian collaborators, exterminated 33,771 Jews in 2 days in one of the largest single massacres of the Holocaust. Both the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the World Jewish Congress condemned the move. Finally, I'd like to bring to your attention one more document. You probably think that the U.S. opposed the Nazis in World War II and even brought them to trial in the Nuremberg war crimes trials, which is true. That's a historical fact. What they didn't tell you was that Alan Dulles, who was then the head of the intelligence in World War II in Switzerland, the OSS, was negotiating behind President Roosevelt's back with Nazi SS officers. The SS are like the worst, the worst of the worst. They're the most brutal military grouping in Hitler's pantheon of military groupings, the Navy, the Wehrmacht, the SS. This guy, his name is General Wolf, to create a separate peace so that the combined Western forces could then reinvade the Soviet Union. Dulles also protected and brought over many Nazis to the United States. And as this internal CIA document proves, allied itself with Bandera and people of his ilk. I'll mention, for those of you who don't know, Alan Dulles was I believe he was the first director of the CIA, and he was also the guy that got us involved with the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Speaking of invading countries, close by, even Kennedy said, don't go there, Alan. In fact, you're fired. But that was when the country had some sort of a conscience and consciousness. Anyway, so when Russia says that Ukraine is run by Nazis and the war in Ukraine is a war between the West and Russia, it's not propaganda, it's fact. If you made donations to Ukraine in its current condition or accused Russia of unprovoked aggression, I suggest you rethink your opinion. And I've included a screenshot of one of these internal CIA documents called Cold War Allies, The Origins of CIA's Relationship with Ukrainian Nationalists. And this is from the CIA.gov reading room. The CIA actually has a library where you can go to and get declassified documents that are they're pretty shocking. When they really did that. What were we doing, allying ourselves with Nazis? There it is. So I'm answering it now. The conclusion is that just as Hillary Clinton openly admitted that the U.S. funded al-Qaeda, and just as the U.S. used ISIS extremists in Syria, as well as other groups like the Contras in Nicaragua in the 1980s, the U.S. has weaponized the Ukrainian far-right extreme nationalist movement to attack Russia. But the mainstream media will never ever tell you that. And why? Because, to quote the Russell Bentley, who I knew personally, he was an American who in 2014 saw the coup unfold, just as I did. I was watching this because I pay attention to these things. He saw civilians being bombed by the Ukrainian Nazis in eastern Ukraine, and he went to fight them. Now, he's younger than me. He said, "Eric, you got to go and fight." I said, "I have no military training. I have bad knees. I'm a pacifist by nature. I'd be a terrible warrior, so don't expect me to do that. All I can do is just speak the truth as I understand it, and that's the best I can do." But anyway, Russell Bentley had this to say: "The American people have been fed bullshit so long they think it's food. So do yourself a favor. Stop demonizing Russia. Had Russia weaponized Quebec separatists, which do exist in Canada, to use Canada the way the U.S. has used Ukraine, the U.S. would have invaded Canada in 5 minutes. The U.S. does not care about the people of Ukraine. It's using Ukraine with the ultimate goal of doing to Russia what it has done to countless other countries: undermine, invade, and steal its resources, rather than simply behave honestly and pay a fair price." Postscript. Following the end of the Soviet Union, the U.S. very nearly destroyed Russia and stole billions in resources. The Soviet Union trusted the United States to do the right thing and help it transition out of communism to capitalism. Well, Russia did get capitalism, but it suffered heavily for it. Putin came to power in 1999 with the idea that Russia could be a partner and a friend of the West. They still harbor this strong inherent trust in the United States, many Russians. Instead, the U.S. slammed the door in Russia's face, from its refusal to allow Russia to become part of NATO, to violating its agreement not to expand NATO, arming Ukraine's coup military, bombing eastern Ukraine for 8 years, and finally, in December 2021, contemptuously rejected a draft treaty for mutual security that Russia had put on the table. The U.S. walked out of most arms control treaties and fomented terrorism in Russia's Chechnya region, as well as color revolutions in Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, Kazakhstan, Belarus. In other words, the U.S. has been at war with Russia starting with the Cold War, and when the Cold War ended with Russia's unilateral disarmament, the U.S. and NATO kept going, culminating in the war in Ukraine to, quote-unquote, fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Probably in 2002, I'm speculating here, but my guess is that when George W. Bush walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was a treaty that was designed to keep strategic balance between the nuclear missile forces of the United States and of Soviet Union and then of Russia. When they walked out of that treaty, they were basically planning for a first nuclear strike on Russia. That treaty basically said that there was an agreement that said if the United States attacked Russia, then Russia could attack the United States, and everybody would die. But the United States had this idea that if they ditched that treaty, they could create anti-missile missiles. And so if Russia retaliated, then the United States would knock those missiles down, Russia would be destroyed, and the United States would win the war unscathed because they knocked down the Russian missiles. That was the idea. And at the time, Russia and Putin said, please don't do that. You're going to destabilize the situation. And but the U.S. just said, sorry, tough for you. That's what we're going to do. You can do whatever you want. So probably in 2002, Russia realized that it made a mistake in disarmament. And since then, it rebuilt its military-industrial complex and prepared for both economic, political, and, if necessary, military war. The West simply cannot believe what has happened. It still thinks Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. It absolves itself of all responsibility for the crisis and assures itself that just one more round of sanctions, one more wonder weapon, will assure it a victory. And Trump, being the kind of person that he is perplexed that his false promises and manipulations don't work. However, after initial setbacks following the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has come back strong. And by employing the absolutely worst elements of Ukraine, the US, UK, NATO agglomeration thought it would get its second chance at taking down Russia following Germany's failure in World War II. It's going to fail again, and it will be the biggest loser. And the reason I say that is because Russia's missile technology is actually far superior to the United States. And so if there were a nuclear exchange, the United States would be wiped out. They are really flirting with catastrophe by provoking Russia the way they do. But they're so obsessed, as I'll point out. After World War II, Roosevelt's goal was to end colonial empires and help former colonies. His plans failed essentially because of the U.S. elite's obsession with controlling the world. In 1948, there was George Kennan wrote a very important piece where he said, we have 6% of the world's population and 50% of its wealth, and we're not going to give that up. And let's not talk about democracy. Let's talk about pure power relations. This is the United States government in its deepest recesses setting policy, and that's what's been going on ever since. This obsession with controlling the world has led us to this dangerous inflection point. But until the people wake up and stop it, things will only get worse. So that is the article that I wrote. I've just read it through for those of you who prefer not to read, and I'll post this and see what you think. I really am trying to wake people up who are still, as I mentioned, there are like three people that I'm good friends with, and they really don't have access to this information. And they say, Eric, so what are you doing, Eric? Well, I'm trying to wake people up. That's what I'm doing, and it's not easy because I'm a very marginal figure. I have, I don't have a huge number of followers, and which may be a good thing because if I were more visible, I might be in more danger. I don't know, but anyway, what I'd like to suggest is that you watch this, share it, comment on it, discuss it with your friends. Gee, did you know Did you know the CIA actually told the truth about Russia's reasons for invading Ukraine? Because the CIA was responsible for it. Anyway, you can donate to my Substack or make a donation to PayPal or buy me a coffee. And that would it would be kind of a big boost to my morale as well as my bank account. So I'd really appreciate that. And again, thank you for listening to my rant here, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.